Good evening. It is good to see everyone this evening. It's been a couple weeks, but if you remember, a couple weeks ago, we talked about the eye. We are looking at different aspects of our world, especially in the last few lessons, our bodies, that show us God's design, that show us more evidence of the fact that the scriptures are actually accurate when they say that God created the world and all those kinds of things. Of course, we can understand because scripture is true that it's true, but a lot of people have called that into question, especially in the last couple hundred years or so with Darwin's theories and things like that. And so we've been talking about some of those different aspects of how we can gain further evidence, and also, not necessarily for our sake as much, but how we can use these kinds of ideas and facts to talk with others, to just ask them questions. Well, what about this? What about that? We're going to continue on in that vein this evening, and we're going to talk about the appendix. So if you have a book in front of you, turn to the very end, and there should be a title labeled appendix right there. Most books have something. No. It's not the book, kind of appendix we're talking about, right? The appendix is a very interesting organ in the body for a lot of different reasons, and we'll get more into that in a second. But the appendix has long been a point of contention in some ways between those who believe in divine creation and those who believe in naturalistic evolution. But as we begin this discussion, I had to put a blocker up there, as I often do for pictures like this. But as we begin this discussion, and we're talking about the evolutionary theories that are involved, we need to talk about vestigial organs. Can someone tell us what a vestigial organ is? What is it? Okay, good. A vestigial organ is an organ that is considered unnecessary. Vestigial means kind of left over. I think, I'm going off the road a little bit here, but I think like vestige, like if something is a vestige, like it's kind of a picture of something that used to be there kind of thing. So a vestigial organ, supposedly, is an organ that is left over from some previous life form or some previous ancestor that is still there, but we don't really need it anymore. So, for example, just going again kind of down a rabbit hole here, but for example, let's say we really did, and obviously we didn't, but let's say we really did evolve from, let's trace down the line somewhere, a monkey? Sure, okay. If there was something that a monkey had that would not be useful to human beings, but we still had it, that would be an example of a vestigial organ. For example, let's say that monkeys had a specific, and this isn't true as far as I know, but had a specific gland in their bodies that helped them digest plants because they almost exclusively eat plants, and we still had that, but it doesn't actually do anything because we eat both plants and animals. Really bad example, but you get the idea. If we still had it, but it doesn't do anything, well, that seems to be evidence that, okay, well, we must have evolved from something that did have it, and it did have a purpose, right? Over time, as the theory of evolution has been developed, they have tried to identify these types of organs, vestigial organs, in a whole lot of different creatures. Especially humans, of course, because we're most interested in ourselves, right? But as a lot of different creatures, they've tried to say, well, this organ doesn't really do anything, that organ doesn't really do anything. They've literally tried to come up with dozens in the human body that don't do anything. And say, well, see, these organs are in our bodies, but they don't do anything. That means we couldn't have been designed as is by, some divine being, because he wouldn't have given us organs that don't do anything. And to be quite frank, I'm kind of inclined to agree. Not in the sense that I agree with the theory of evolution, but in the sense that if we did in fact have organs that were just there and literally didn't do anything, I'm not saying that would prove that evolution was true, but it would kind of give us cause to think, why in the world would God do that? God is a God of purpose. Why would he put things in our bodies that don't do anything? Because after all, if God designed us, we would expect him to design us correctly, right? So let's consider what some people have said about this. So we're going to be quoting from a few different sources, proponents of evolution tonight. And I don't have all the sources up here. If you want to get sources, then talk to me later. But I have sources coming out of my ears right now at school. Vestigial organs have demonstrated remarkably how species are related to one another. Again, this is an evolutionist. And has given solid ground for the idea of common descent to stand on. That's a fancy way of saying, because there's all these vestigial organs, we can see how different creatures are related to each other in the chain of evolution, and that's further evidence for evolution itself. Well, let's talk about that. Let's start with the appendix. And I say start, that's what we're talking about tonight, but let's begin talking about the appendix. Now, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but just out of curiosity, how many of y'all have gotten your appendix removed? That's what I figured, right? That's not really a weird thing. Like, a lot of people have their appendix removed. Sometimes it's because some kind of appendicitis begins, and you're like, okay, we're done, we're getting that out of here. Sometimes it's just for other reasons. There could be all sorts of different reasons. Sometimes it's preventative. For example, some people are more prone to infection. I don't know all the medical reasons, but the bottom line is there are a whole lot of people that have gotten their appendix removed. In fact, if I remember correctly, we're talking tens of thousands every year, I think just in the United States, again, I'm a little hazy on the number, that have their appendix removed. Now, just at face value, if you yank an organ out of your body, and I know you didn't do it that way for those of y'all who did it, I'm not saying that's what you did, but if you yank an organ out of your body, does it seem like that must not do anything to help you if you got it out and you seem just fine, right? In other words, it seems like no harm, no foul, we removed it and nothing's changed. Well, what is the main reason why, if anybody know about this, what is the main reason why people have their appendix removed? Okay. If it gets infected, if you do have appendicitis, and I don't mean to be gross here, but if your appendix bursts while it's inside your body, if it gets infected, it swells, and it bursts inside your body, you got major problems all of a sudden, right? Not only do you have major problems because there's blood and things like that, internal bleeding type deal, but because there's a lot of things, if it got infected, right, it's spreading the infection throughout your body. People have described the appendix, in fact, multiple people have described it as a ticking time bomb inside your body. Basically, just kind of describing it as, well, it's a matter of time until it blows, right? And so we need to get it out of there before then. That's one of the main reasons why people have their appendix removed. In fact, there are even people who have absolutely no reason to think that their appendix is in any immediate danger, but they just say, well, we don't need it anyway, so they just get it out anyway. It's interesting because of this narrative of the appendix being a vestigial organ, if you haven't put two and two together, right? An appendix is right at the top of the list of what scientists at least used to believe was a leftover from our ancestors. For a long, long time, people would see the appendix and they would say, well, it doesn't seem to do anything, and it can cause harm. Obviously, it's not meant to be in the human body, meaning it's just left over from something else, but doesn't actually have any purpose. Another example, another article says, in plant-eating vertebrates, the appendix is much larger, and its main function is to help digest a largely herbivorous diet, Herbivorous, thank you. I was like, I know how to say that word. Herbivorous diet. The human appendix does not directly assist digestion, talking about in humans. So basically, they're making the point that in plant-eating animals, like herbivores, this is very useful for them to digest the plants that they eat constantly. But for humans, again, because our diets aren't purely plants, at least not most people, it doesn't really directly adjust, man, I cannot talk tonight. It does not directly assist digestion. Much smaller, seemingly much less useful. And so the idea, especially for like primates and things like that, meaning like monkeys and apes, because it's so much larger in there, they say, well, eventually when we evolved for monkeys, it got smaller because it was less useful, but it still hung around. And so therefore, that's more evidence that we evolved for monkeys. Yay, right? But let's talk about that a little more. Biologists believe, same guy, continuing, biologists believe it is a vestigial organ left behind from a plant-eating ancestor. And notice what he says here. Any secondary function that the appendix might perform certainly is not missed in those who had it removed before it might have ruptured. In other words, if you're one of the folks that got your appendix out, any other thing it might have done, you're not missing out, because it really doesn't do anything. It's just left over. Now this particular quote is actually from a list of essentially the top 10 vestigial organs. And guess what's at number 1? The appendix. So this is one of the arguments that has been made for a long time, not just about the appendix, but about vestigial organs in general. This is clear evidence that we evolved from monkeys. This is clear evidence that we were not the final or the original form, if you will, that we came from other things, because we have all these leftover organs. Well, let's ask a question. Now, again, try not to get too gross in this class tonight. We could go way down the road with this, but without being too explicit, what happens when you get a stomach bug? We probably all had one within the last, 3 months, right? It's been going around. Do what?
It's not fun.
It's no fun. You have all sorts of stuff in your body, specifically in your digestive tract, right? And in your stomach, in your intestines, you have a lot of fluids, a lot of different things that aid your digestion. When you have a stomach bug, whatever you go through in that process, most of that's flushed out, right? Now, when it's flushed out, a lot of times what we don't realize is that creates more problems than just the discomfort of going through that process. Whenever your system gets all flushed out with something like a stomach bug, it creates a change in your body's balance. Not physical balance, like you start getting dizzy necessarily, although that can happen too. But it creates a problem in the balance of a lot of those fluids and chemicals and things like that. But not just fluids and chemicals. Anybody know what else besides fluids, like digestive fluids and stuff like that, stomach acid and stuff like that? Anybody know what else is in our digestive tract that helps us digest things? There is a ton. Oh, what happened? There is a ton of bacteria in there. Maybe wiggle the cord and see if it'll come back up. It's up on the TV. I don't know what it's doing. Well, anyway, I'll keep going. If nothing else, I can see it. Y'all just look behind you. But ultimately, what happens whenever you are digesting your food, once it gets to a certain point in the digestive system, you have all these fluids and stuff that help break it down, but there are also positive, meaning good bacteria in your digestive system to help you digest these things. We usually, because now we're aware of what causes diseases, right? We usually think of bacteria and viruses and any kind of microorganisms. We usually think of that as a bad thing because it causes disease. In fact, can anyone tell us what a Germex bottle or something like that? What does it say on the bottle to try and get you to buy it? It kills what? What's the number?
99.9%.
It's always 99.99% of bacteria, right? You want to hear something really funny? I had no idea about this until not very long ago. 99 point something percent of bacteria is actually good for you, or at least not bad for you. Now, I'm not saying it's the same 99% that they're talking about, but the vast majority of microorganisms are not actually bad for us. However, there are a few that are. But the ones in our digestive tract are helpful, at least when they stay in our digestive tract. When you flush out your system, for example, when you have a stomach bug or something like that going on, what do you think happens to all that bacteria? It goes with everything else, right? It's all out of your system. Well, that can create a problem. You see, all this helpful bacteria, when it gets flushed, that means that now, as you're trying to recover, well, you're trying to begin eating again, at least slowly, right? But what does it take for bacteria to grow? That can really help, for sure, right? You eat something with probiotics in it. Interestingly enough, if you don't know, there's probiotics versus antibiotics. Pro means it's facilitating the growth of bacteria. Anti means it's killing it. So probiotics means you're trying to cultivate this kind of bacteria. It Again, I know this is kind of gross, but it's fascinating when you really think of it in terms of God's design. So you have all this bacteria that's gone. Well, you got to get some more like it back. But it's not like the bacteria is just already there waiting. It's like there's bacterial eggs or something in your body just waiting to sprout again, and now you're all good again. I know, again, kind of gross. What happens instead is that the appendix, we now think what happens is the appendix essentially helps restart your bacteria in your digestive system. Now, in our culture, in our country, that is not as big of a deal because we have things like clean drinking water and various sanitation and things like that. So even if we didn't have, for example, those of y'all who don't have your appendix, right? Even if you don't have something that helps replenish that, it doesn't make too much of a difference for us in practical terms because, well, we don't have issues with things that are going into our digestive system that are really going to get messed up if we don't have all those bacteria, because we take real great pains with how we prepare our food and stuff like that. But another show of hands, has anyone ever been to a third world country before? If you haven't, but you've read a little bit about the situation there, most third world countries don't have clean water, at least not easy access to it. A lot of times they don't have great sanitation even in terms of their food. For example, Liz has gone to Nicaragua several times, and something that she can tell you is that they are very specific when the white people come over, because the people who are hosting them know, y'all don't need to eat this, and this. These are the things that are safe for you to eat. Well, why? Well, because their bodies have become accustomed to certain kinds of bacteria that ours have not. And so if we get exposed to it, it's like, whoa, big shock to the system. But in a civilization, in a setting where you don't have sanitation, if you get hit with something and you don't have a way to replenish your bacterial balance in your body, that's going to create a huge problem, potentially even a life-threatening problem. And so all of a sudden the appendix looks a lot more useful, doesn't it? Because sanitation hasn't exactly been something that human beings have done a good job at for most of our history. We just haven't known about it. I mean, anybody know when germ theory was first introduced? I don't mean exact date, but ballpark. Anybody know when we first found out about germs? Yeah, the 1800s. That means for 200 out of the last 6,000 plus years of human history, we've known about germs. That's a lot of years that we haven't known anything about it. That's a lot of years that stuff like the appendix is really, really, really important. Now, this is funny. Another article by an evolutionist talking about the appendix and talking about how now we've figured out that the appendix does this. Notice what he says. He describes this theory. He says that's the theory anyway. It would make sense for the appendix to have had some sort of function as it independently evolved in many species over time. Now, what just happened? We've talked about how vestigial organs, right? Multiple evolutionists, we've looked at quotes about how they've described this as a good evidence for evolution because it seems to not have a use. And now that they're discovering it has a use, what did he just do?
He changed it to a specific species rather than evolving from some sort of slime in a pond.
Okay, that's one thing he did. Very good. He's saying it evolved separately in all these species over time instead of trying to tie them all together. That's one thing he did. What else did he do? Did he do anything else? The existence of supposed vestigial organs, is that evidence for evolution according to the evolutionists? Because they are useless? And now that they find out they're useful, what's their response? Well, now it's still evidence for evolution. You see the problem? When something's useless, it's evidence for evolution. When it's useful, it's evidence for evolution. There's no objective approach here. We're sticking with our theory. We're just going to twist everything that we can to fit our theory. You would think that if for decades, if not centuries, people have talked about, centuries at this point anyway, people have talked about the appendix being evidence for evolution, and then they find out that that narrative doesn't work, you would think they would maybe at least in this area step back and say, okay, we were wrong on that. No, they just try and spin it a different way to where it's still evidence for evolution. This is a helpful thing for us. I'm going to pause here for just a second. Sorry, y'all can't see the slide. I'm not sure what happened, but I'm going to pause here for just a second because this is a useful thing for us to work through. Remember, our goal here is to try and use these kinds of things in our conversations with people. Now, if you are having a discussion with someone and they say, here is some evidence for whatever you're talking about, and you respond and say, let me show you why that's not actually evidence, and they say, oh yeah, you're right, so it's evidence in a different way now. What are you going to do? Well, that's when you try and point out, hey, let's pause for a minute. That's not how this works. You don't get to just say, oh, it's evidence over here, it's evidence over here. All you're doing is assuming what you're trying to prove, and then on the back end of it, you're trying to plug in the evidence. What we should always be trying to do, not just as Christians, but as rational people, we should always start with the evidence and follow where it leads. Not start with an idea and then try and plug in the evidence. What did we talk about at the very beginning when we started talking about apologetics? What did we talk about as one of the dangers of studying apologetics? I'm not saying we shouldn't study it, but what's a trap we can fall into when we study apologetics? Yes, that's one of them. We can replace our faith with stuff like apologetics. What's the other one? We talked about two different ones. That was one of them. What's the other one? We can just accept things if they seem to support our view without following up and saying, is that actually true? This is a good example of the other side, quote unquote, doing that. But it's also an important reminder to us, if we're going to point things like this out, we can't be guilty of the same thing. As we talked about before, for example, when in Scripture it mentions the circle of the earth, if we try and make that into something of, oh, they're saying the earth is round in Scripture before anyone knew it, number one, they did already know it at the time. It just wasn't widespread knowledge, but they did know it. And number two, that's not what the Scripture's saying in the first place. And number three, we'll add another one extra in there. If that was what he was saying, that wouldn't have made sense to the original audience. It would have actually detracted from what God was trying to inspire the men to say. But it sounds like it's supporting our point of view, and so we latch onto it. So we look at something like this. We don't ever want to be guilty of trying to start with an assumption and then bring in all the evidence afterward. If we're talking with someone, they need to see us saying, I'm willing to follow the evidence, truth, wherever it leads. Because if something is true, we know that that means it came from where? If something is true, where did it come from? God. Doesn't matter if it's true in science, doesn't matter if it's true in math, doesn't matter if it's true in biology, it doesn't matter. If it's true, ultimately it came from God. God is the source of all truth, not just religious truth, all truth. So we should never be afraid to follow evidence. But sometimes we fall into the same trap. So I want to pause and point that out as we are looking here. Can't help, though, but think of Psalm 139. You formed my inward parts, the psalmist says. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. It's funny, as I said toward the beginning, if we had organs in our body that literally did not do anything, Yeah, that kind of would be strange. I would be confused. God, why would you do that? That doesn't seem like you. You always act with purpose. We talked about there are dozens of supposed vestigial organs in the human body. Well, those lists were presented a while back. Since then, more and more research has been done. Guess how many of those currently have absolutely no function that has been found? In other words, guess how many of those are still considered completely useless? Not a single one. We found uses for every single vestigial organ, quote unquote, that people have presented as being evidence for evolution. And yet, if you want to go and see what evolutionists write about those things, they do exactly what we saw with the appendix. Oh yeah, that's actually evidence for evolution because of a different reason, right? They're not accepting the evidence. This should be evidence for us that they're interested in proving their point of view rather than actually following the evidence. But we have to make sure we don't fall into the same trap. We have truth on our side. We don't need to take shortcuts. We don't need to skip over important information. We don't need to start beyond the evidence and then come back. When we're having these kind of discussions, we shouldn't be afraid to follow the evidence. Truth will lead to God. That's always going to be the case. And that's something we can always be confident in. Far from being a useless leftover, the appendix is a support for our immune system. And yet again, that points us to God's design. Just thinking for a second about the ticking time bomb analogy. If an appendix had actually evolved, how many times do you think once an appendix evolves, it's going to explode and kill the creature that it evolved into? Right? How many times do they have to get it wrong before they get it right? But wait a minute, and this is something we'll see as we continue on through this study of apologetics. What happens anytime you don't have a fully functioning organ or a fully functioning system in a body? If it kills them, what happens? Do you just start back where you were, like you auto-save there, and then you keep on going from where you were? No, the thing is dead. You got to start all the way at the beginning. Well, for something like the appendix that can have issues with like appendicitis and bursting and stuff like that, that creates even another problem. In fact, in a sense, that's even more evidence for God's designing it, because otherwise, yikes. You have a mechanism there that essentially keeps something like this from being passed on. Why on earth would an appendix get passed on through evolutionary processes if it does have such a tendency to self-destruct, if you will? So we'll wrap up there for tonight. But I hope this once again gives us more of a sense of how to approach these kind of issues. More, more ammunition in our arsenal, more ways to also remind ourselves that we've got to be just as honest with the evidence as we require of the other side. Because the last thing we want to do is give opponents of Christianity any reason to genuinely call us into question. They'll have plenty of reasons to get onto us. We don't want to give them anything else. But if we're honest, then we have the right to call out and say, wait a minute, that's not the way you handle this. You can't take the same thing on two different levels and try and make it evidence on both sides. So, as always, the Lord's invitation is open. We want to encourage each other. We want to help one another, both as we are living our own Christian lives and as, I hope, throughout this study, that we're learning how to engage others and teaching them about Christ as well. So if there's anything that we can do to aid you or encourage you, please let us know as we stand and sing together.
Sweetly, Lord, we have heard thee calling, come, follow me.